In the winter of 1885, in Wyoming's Wind River Valley, where the cold cuts deeper than any blade, a solitary man named Amos Caldwell stumbled upon a young Shoshone woman fighting for her life. She was fleeing a fate not of her choosing, a forced marriage to a man who saw her as property, not a person. Her name was Tala, and her escape was an act of defiance against a world that sought to chain her. Amos, a former cavalry scout with blood on his hands and guilt in his heart, had no reason to care. He'd turned his back on the world years ago, living alone in a cabin where memories festered like open wounds. Yet, when he saw her hand break through the ice of a frozen creek, something stirred in him, a spark of redemption he thought had died long ago. This story, rooted in the untold struggles of America's frontier, unfolds over 3 parts, each a testament to the cost of freedom and the power of unlikely alliances. In this first part, spanning the bitter early days of their encounter, you'll witness a bond forged in silence, a manhunt through snow-choked pines, and the shadow of a past neither can outrun. Expect moments that grip your heart, challenge your sense of justice, and make you question what it means to be free. Stay with us through this journey, because in these 5,000 words, you'll find a story that lingers, demanding you weigh the price of mercy against the weight of history. The cold was a living thing that winter, the kind that didn't just settle on your skin, but burrowed into your marrow, hollowing you out until you forgot what warmth felt like. Amos Caldwell rode alone along the ridge above Elk Creek, his horse, a gray mare named Juniper, picking her way through snowdrifts that swallowed her hooves. The Wind River Valley stretched out below, a vast white scar under a sky too gray to promise anything but more snow. Amos, 49, wore a buffalo hide coat, its edges frayed from years of neglect, and a hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much. His beard was streaked with silver, his hands calloused from a life of labor and loss. The only sound was the crunch of snow under Juniper's steps and the faint whistle of wind through the pines. He hadn't spoken to another soul in months, not since the last trader passed through in late fall, bartering salt for pelts. Amos preferred it that way. Words had a way of digging up things better left, buried memories of a wife gone to fever, a daughter lost to the same, and a decade spent scouting for an army that left him with nothing but a scarred shoulder and a ledger of regrets. Out here, in the nowhere of Wyoming, there was no one to judge, no one to forgive. Just the land and its unrelenting silence. Down in the hollow, where the creek twisted through a stand of frost-blackened willows, something caught his eye. A shadow moved, not quick, but desperate, like a wounded animal trying to hide. Amos reined Juniper to a halt, his breath clouding in the air. He squinted, leaning forward in the saddle. There, where the ice bowed under the current, a hand broke through, pale, trembling, fingers clawing at nothing. The creek wasn't deep, but it was deadly, its cold a thief that stole life slow and sure. Amos didn't call out. There was no one to hear him anyway. He slid from the saddle, boots sinking into the snow, and scrambled down the bank. The ice groaned under his weight as he crawled forward, spreading his body to keep it from cracking. His fingers, numb in their gloves, brushed the hand beneath the surface. It was small, too small, and when he grabbed it, she came up too easily. Like the river had already claimed most of her. Her skin was gray with cold, lips cracked and bloodless, hair matted with ice and mud. She was young, maybe 20, Shoshone by her features, cheekbones, dark eyes half open, staring at nothing. Bruises circled her wrists, raw and red, like she'd been bound until the rope gave way. Amos didn't hesitate. He hauled her over his shoulder, her weight barely registering, and stumbled back to Juniper. The mare snorted, eyes wide, but held steady as he draped the girl across the saddle. His breath came in sharp bursts, each one a reminder of how little time she had. The cabin was a mile off, a low-slung thing of pine logs and a sagging roof, tucked against a stand of cedars. Amos kicked the door open, laid her on the cot near the stove, and set to work. He didn't touch her skin, not direct like it, a blanket between his hands and her body. Knowing too well what unwanted touch could do to a soul already broken, he placed hot stones under her arms, another at her feet, and stoked the pot-belly stove until it roared. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rattle in her chest, but she didn't stir. Amos sat back, his coat steaming from the heat, and watched her. The cabin was small, its walls stained with smoke and time. A single window let in a sliver of gray light, snow piling against the glass. On the table, a tin cup and a half-empty jar of beans sat beside a Bible, its pages yellowed and warped. It had been Clara's, his wife's, untouched since her death, but always there, like a debt he couldn't pay. He didn't open it now, just let his fingers rest on the cover, the leather cool under his palm. Hours passed. The girl's breathing steadied, but she didn't wake. Amos noticed the marks on her wrists again, the skin torn where ropes had bitten deep. Under the torn sleeve of her dress, he saw something else, signed letters. Faded but unmistakable. Property. The word hit him like a fist. He'd seen it before, on cattle, on crates, never on a person. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he turned to the fire, feeding it another log, and murmured a verse from memory. More for himself than her. He will not leave you in the deep, nor forsake you when the waters rise. His voice was rough, unused, like gravel underfoot. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint crunch of hooves fresh, not weathered, the kind made by iron shoes. Amos froze, his eyes on the window. The frost framed a shadow beyond the trees, too deliberate to be chance. He didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the wall, not yet. Some things needed watching first. The girl stirred, a sharp exhale breaking the silence, her fingers twitching like she was still running from something. Amos stayed where he was, letting the firelight dance across the room, and waited. Trouble had a way of finding you out here, and he'd learned long ago that running only made it hungrier. She woke like a cornered animal, eyes wide, chest heaving, her body snapping upright on the cot. Her gaze darted from the timber walls to the stove's glow to the man sitting across the room. Amos didn't move, his hands loose in his lap, the Bible still open but unread. Her hand shot to the table, closing around a small knife he'd left there for cutting twine. She held it to her throat, the blade trembling but close enough to draw blood. "Don't," she whispered, her voice raw, barely audible. "I'll do it. I've done worse." Amos didn't flinch. He stood slowly, palms open, and turned his back to her. Without a word, he walked to the door and stepped outside, letting the cold rush in behind him. The silence stretched, heavy as the snow piling against the cabin. She sat there, knife still in hand, the fire crackling like it was mocking her fear. Her fingers loosened, and the blade fell to the floor with a dull clink. More exhaustion than surrender. She stood, legs unsteady, and touched the wall as she moved, as if testing the world's reality. The cabin was Berea cot, a chair, a cast-iron pan still warm on the stove. No chains, no locks, nothing to cage her. She stepped outside, the snow biting her bare feet, but she didn't stop. Amos stood by a fence post, his hat low, breath clouding in the gray dusk. He didn't look at her, just let her see the open valley, the endless white stretching toward the horizon. She could run. She didn't. That night, she lay on the cot, wrapped in the same blanket she'd nearly died in. The wind clawed at the window, and the stove's heat fought back. Her fingers traced the ink on her wrist, the word property still legible despite the water and time. She didn't sleep, not really, just drifted into memories that weren't clear hands holding her down. A room thick with smoke and fear, the snap of a leather strap. She flinched, her jaw tightening, but the cabin held her in its quiet. Amos sat by the fire, his eyes on the flames. He hadn't spoken since she woke, hadn't asked her name or her story. He'd left the knife where it fell, the door unbarred. He could have taken it, could have demanded answers, but he didn't. When the fire dimmed, he added a log, glancing once to see if she was breathing. She was, curled tight under the blanket, her face hidden, but her chest rising steady. In the deep night, she rose, silent as a shadow, and stood in the open doorway. Snow dusted her bare feet, her arms bare to the cold, but she didn't move. She stared into the dark, lips pressed tight, breath sharp. Amos watched from the firelight, saying nothing. He stepped closer, slow enough for her to hear, and draped a quilt over her shoulder-soled, patched, smelling of cedar and thyme. She didn't pull away, just stood there, the weight of the quilt settling like a promise she wasn't ready to trust. The next morning, she fetched water from the creek, her hands red from the cold by the time she returned. She boiled it for tea, made none for him, but set a cup by his chair anyway. Amos came in from chopping wood, his breath heavy, and took the cup without comment. They didn't speak, didn't need to, but the silence felt different now, less like a wall and more like a shared burden. That evening, when he lit the lantern, she didn't hide her face. When he left his gloves by the stove, she folded them, no flourish, just a small act. Amos noticed the bruises then, purple at her collarbone, faint marks down her arms like ghosts of fingers. She saw him looking but didn't flinch. He turned away, giving her the room, and she didn't look at him again that night. Before bed, she set an empty tin cup upside down by the stove, deliberate, like a marker of something unspoken. It was enough. The days that followed were a slow thaw, not in the weather but in the space between them. Small acts built a fragile Bridgia's second cup on the table, a pan scrubbed clean, her humming low and uneven as she mended a tear in the curtain. Amos kept to his routine wood, checking traps, fixing what broke bit each time he returned. The cabin was a little less empty, a little less broken. On the fourth day, Amos opened a trunk he hadn't touched in years. Inside were relics of a life he'd tried to forget, letters from Clara, a child's shoe, a cavalry badge he'd sworn never to look at again. Beneath it all was a journal, its pages stained with ink and guilt. He didn't read it, not yet, but he held it, the weight heavier than the wood he carried. The journal wasn't a record of battles won. It was a tally of lives lost, names reduced to numbers, villages burned under orders he'd followed without question. He closed the trunk, his hands shaking, and sat by the fire, the journal unopened in his lap. Tala watched him from the cot, her eyes sharp but silent. She didn't ask, didn't need to. She'd seen the badge when she swept the floor, its eagle emblem glinting in the dust. She didn't touch it, just stared, then stepped outside and shaped a lump of river clay into the same emblem. She carved it smooth, held it to the light, then crushed it in her hand, letting the pieces fall. When she returned, clay still clung to her palms, and she didn't wash it off. Amos saw, and something shifted in the room, not peace, but a shared weight, like two people carrying a load without arguing over who dropped it first. The next morning, he left a bundle on the Coda wool dress, faded green, once Clara's. Tala ran her fingers over the stitching, the name Clara barely visible in the thread. She nodded once, slow, and that was enough. She swept the porch, fixed a loose hinge, mended one of his shirts. Amos chopped wood until his hands bled, the pile already taller than he needed. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was a bridge, not crossed, but there. That night, Amos sat outside, the wind sharp against his face. He watched Tala through the window, her silhouette steady as she held a mug, not drinking, just holding it. He understood then some people didn't need saving, just space to remember who they were. Tala picked up the cavalry badge again, turning it in her hand. It wasn't pain now, but choice. Amos stared at the horizon, the sky bruising purple, and knew some stories were told in what you burned and what you kept. Smoke curled over the pines the next morning, not from the cabin, but from the valley below. It was faint, a warning whispered in ash. Amos smelled it before Tala did, his chest tightening with a soldier's instinct. He stepped outside, boots sinking into fresh snow, and scanned the ridge. A second plume rose, blacker, closer. Behind him, Tala appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing. She didn't ask what it was. She knew. The air turned bitter, thick with the scent of burning timber. Amos grabbed his rifle, checking the chamber with hands that didn't shake. Tala moved inside, gathering what little she had, a knife, a blanket, the dress. Her movements were quick, practiced, like someone who'd run before. Amos didn't tell her to stay. He knew she wouldn't. They stepped into the snow, Juniper tethered nearby, her ears twitching. The smoke was thicker now, rising from the direction of a Shoshone camp Amos had seen once. Miles off, hidden in the folds of the valley. Voices carried on the wind, sharp, urgent, not English. Tala's jaw tightened, her hand closing around the knife. Amos met her eyes, a question unasked. She nodded, once, and they moved toward the smoke, toward the storm they both knew was coming. As the smoke rose over the pines in Wyoming's Wind River Valley, Amos Caldwell and Tala stepped into a storm they couldn't outrun. The winter of 1885 had already tested the Mamos. a former cavalry scout haunted by a past of blood and betrayal, and Tala, a young Shoshone woman who'd clawed her freedom from a man who branded her as property. Their bond, forged in the silence of a snowbound cabin, was fragile but real, built on small acts of trust, a cup of tea, a folded glove, a quilt draped over trembling shoulders. Now, the scent of burning timber carried a warning men were coming. Men who saw Tala not as a person but as a bounty. In this second part, spanning over 5,000 words, you'll walk with them through a manhunt that tests their resolve, witness choices that blur the line between justice and vengeance, and feel the weight of a past that refuses to stay buried. Stay with us, because this chapter of their journey asks hard questions. Can you protect someone without losing yourself? And what does freedom cost when the law serves power, not truth? The smoke thickened as Amos and Tala moved toward the valley's heart, where the Shoshone camp lay hidden in a fold of snow-draped hills. The air was sharp with ash, the kind that stung the eyes and clung to the throat. Amos led the way, his rifle slung across his back, his boots breaking through the crust of snow. Juniper, his gray mare, followed close, her breath steaming in the cold. Tala walked beside him, her knife tucked into the waist of her dress, her eyes scanning the trees like someone who'd learned to trust nothing but her own instincts. The wind carried faint cries, no Shoshone voices, urgent, threaded with fear. Amos glanced at Tala, but she didn't meet his gaze. Her jaw was set, her hands steady, but he saw the pulse at her throat, quick and fierce. They crested a ridge, and the camp came into view, a cluster of lodges, half buried in snow. Their buffalo hides blackened at the edges where flames had begun to lick. Women and children darted between the tents, gathering what they could, while men stood at the perimeter, bows drawn, eyes fixed on the tree line. A barn at the camp's edge burned low and greedy, its roof sagging under the fire's weight. Amos crouched, pulling Tala down beside him. "Stay low," he whispered, his voice rough but calm. She nodded, her fingers tightening around the knife. Across the clearing, hoofprints carved sharp paths in the snow, fresh, deep, made by iron-shod horses. Amos counted 3 sets, maybe 4, leading into the pines. Bounty hunters, he figured, or worse, men with badges who answered to money, not law. He'd ridden with their kind once, years ago, when orders were easier to follow than questions. The memory sat heavy in his chest, but he pushed it down. Tala pointed to a trail of blood, faint but unmistakable, leading from the barn to the woods. "Someone's hurt," she said, her voice low, steady. Amos nodded, his eyes on the smoke. "Or dead." They moved down the slope, keeping to the shadows of the cedars. The cries grew louder, children wailing, a woman shouting commands in Shoshone. Tala's steps quickened, her body leaning forward like she could reach them faster than the fire. Amos grabbed her arm, gentle but firm. "Not yet," he said. "We go in blind, we're no good to them." She pulled free, her eyes flashing, but she stayed put, her breath sharp in the silence. A shot cracked through the air, sharp as a whip. The lodge nearest the barn shuddered, a bullet tearing through its hide wall. A child screamed, the sound cut off by a mother's hand. Amos dropped to one knee, his rifle in hand now, his eyes scanning the tree line. Movement flickered near a stand of elk traps boots, a glint of metal. He sighted, his finger steady on the trigger, but didn't fire. Not yet. Tala crouched beside him, her knife drawn, her body coiled like a spring. Another shot, closer, splintering a lodge pole. The camp erupted, women pulling children toward the ravine, men loosing arrows into the trees. Amos saw the shooter then, a man in a long coat, his face shadowed by a hat, reloading a Winchester with hands to calm for the chaos. Beside him, another figure moved, younger, quicker, lighting a torch with a match struck on his boot. Amos's gut twisted. Fire was a coward's weapon, meant to flush out prey, not fight it. "Tala," he said, his voice low, "get to the ravine. Help them hide." She shook her head, her eyes fierce. "I'm not running." Amos met her gaze, saw the steel in it, and nodded. "Then stay close." They moved together, skirting the camp's edge, the snow muffling their steps. The torch-bearer stepped forward, his flame casting an orange glow across the snow. Amos raised his rifle, sighted, and fired. The man dropped, the torch hissing out in the snow. The older shooter spun, his Winchester up, but Amos was already moving, pulling Tala behind a stack of firewood. Bullets tore through the wood, splinters flying like shrapnel. Amos fired back, blind, just to keep the man pinned. Tala darted left, low and fast, disappearing into the smoke. Amos cursed under his breath but didn't call after her. She knew what she was doing, or he hoped she did. The shooter shouted something, a name Rufus, maybe, and another voice answered from the trees, deep and commanding. A third man, then. Amos reloaded, his hands steadied despite the cold creeping into his bones. The camp was chaos now, flames spreading to a second lodge, children crying as they fled toward the ravine. Tala reappeared, her dress torn at the hem, her hands bloody from scrambling over rocks. She held a bow now, taken from a fallen warrior, an arrow nocked and ready. "They're circling," she said, her voice tight. "3 of them, maybe more." Amos nodded, his eyes on the trees. "Get to the ravine. Cover them." This time, she didn't argue, just gave him a look that said more than words could, then slipped into the shadows. Amos moved toward the barn, its flames hissing as snow melted around it. A bullet grazed his coat, tearing the hide at his shoulder. He ducked behind a water trough, his breath coming hard. The shooter Rufus, he dead-stepped into the open, his face clear now, weathered, scarred, eyes cold as the creek that nearly killed Tala. Amos fired, missed, the bullet kicking up snow. Rufus grinned, a predator's smile, and raised his rifle. Before he could fire, an arrow sliced through the air, burying itself in his thigh. Rufus staggered, cursing, his shot going wide. Tala stood at the ravine's edge, her bow drawn, another arrow ready. Amos didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time hitting Rufus in the shoulder. The man dropped, blood blooming dark against the snow, but he wasn't done. Crawling toward his rifle with a stubbornness that spoke of hate, not duty. A new voice cut through the chaos, loud, measured, not a shout but a command. "Enough!" Amos froze, his rifle still raised. A man stepped from the trees, his coat dusted with snow, a badge glinting at his chest. Marshal Elias Thorne. Amos knew him by reputation, a man who wore the law like a crown, bending it to whoever paid most. Behind him, 2 deputies flanked, one older, grizzled, the other young, barely 20. His eyes wide but his gun steady. "Amos Caldwell," Thorne called, his voice carrying over the crackle of flames. "You're harboring a fugitive. Hand her over, and this ends clean." Amos didn't move, his rifle trained on Thorne. "She's no fugitive," he said, his voice flat. "She's a woman who chose to live." Thorne's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on his revolver. "Got papers say different. Breach of contract, theft of property. You know how this works, Caldwell. Don't make it harder than it needs to be." Amos spat into the snow. "Property? You mean her. That's what your paper says, ain't it?" Thorne sighed, like a man tired of explaining. "Law's the law. Step aside." He nodded to his deputies, and the older one moved first, his rifle loose but ready. The younger one, Samuel, Amos guessed, hesitated, his eyes flicking to the camp, to the children cowering in the ravine. Tala stood at the edge, her bow still drawn, her gaze locked on Thorne. Amos saw the moment stretch, the air tight as a noose. The standoff broke fast. The older deputy lunged, grabbing for Amos's rifle. Amos twisted, slamming his elbow into the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. Samuel raised his gun, but his hands shook, his eyes on Tala, not Amos. "Don't," Amos said, his voice low, steady. "You ain't your father, boy. Don't die for his mistakes." Samuel froze, his gun wavering. Thorne drew his revolver, quick and smooth, but before he could fire, Tala's arrow flew, grazing his arm. He cursed, dropping the gun, blood staining his sleeve. Amos tackled Samuel, pinning him to the snow, the boy's gun skittering away. The older deputy was up now, bloodied but swinging, and Amos took a hit to the ribs, pain flaring white-hot. He fought back, dirty, raw, driven by something deeper than survival. Tala was there, her knife flashing, cutting the deputy's belt free, his holster falling. She didn't kill, didn't maim, just disarmed, her movements swift, precise. The camp watched, silent now, the flames dying as snow smothered the fire. Thorne staggered to his feet, clutching his arm, his face twisted with rage. "You're dead, Caldwell," he spat. "Both of you." Amos stood, breathing hard, his ribs screaming. "Not today," he said, his rifle back in hand. Samuel lay in the snow, his eyes wide, not fighting, just staring at Tala like he'd seen something the law hadn't taught him. Tala lowered her bow, her chest heaving, but her eyes stayed on Thorn. "Go," she said, her voice low, fierce, "or I won't miss next time." Thorn laughed, a bitter sound. "You think this is over? There's a price on your head, girl. Men like me don't stop." He backed toward the trees, his deputy scrambling to follow, leaving Rufus bleeding in the snow. Samuel stayed, his hands raised, his face pale. "I didn't sign up for this," he said, his voice breaking. "Not for burning homes." Amos looked at him, saw the boy beneath the badge, and nodded. "Then help us." Samuel hesitated, then picked up his gun, not to fight, but to holster it. Tala watched him, her bow still ready, but she didn't fire. The camp was quiet now, the fire dead, the air heavy with ash and loss. Women emerged from the ravine, children clinging to their skirts. An elder stepped forward, her eyes cloudy but sharp, and touched Tala's arm, whispering something Amos didn't understand. They bound Rufus's wounds, not out of mercy, but to keep him alive for answers. He cursed them, his voice weak, spitting blood into the snow. "You don't know who's coming," he said, his grin sickly. "This ain't just about her. It's bigger." Amos didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough of the world to know power didn't chase one woman without reason. Night fell, the sky bruising purple, clouds low and heavy. They made camp in the ruins of the lodge, the walls scorched but standing. Amos sat tied to a post, his wrists raw, his ribs aching. Tala sat across from him, her knees drawn up, her eyes on the fire. Samuel stood guard, his gun loose at his side, his face torn between duty and doubt. Thorn was gone, but his shadow lingered, a promise of more to come. Tala shifted, her hand slipping into her coat, closing around something small, sharp as stone. Amos saw, jagged at the edges. She pressed it to her wrist, not hard enough to cut, but enough to feel it. Amos leaned forward, his voice low. "Don't," he said. "You're worth more than that." She froze, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, the world was just them, the firelight flickering on her face. Samuel moved before Amos could, kneeling beside her, his hand gentle but firm, easing the stone from her grip. "You don't have to," he said, his voice soft, uncertain. Tala didn't fight, didn't speak, just let the stone fall, her shoulders trembling. Samuel looked at Amos, a question in his eyes, and Amos nodded, once, slow. The boy stood, his back to the fire, and didn't meet Thorn's gaze when the marshal's voice echoed in his memory. They didn't sleep that night. The wind howled, carrying the scent of ash and blood. Amos watched Tala, saw the way her hands stayed clenched, her eyes distant but alive. Samuel paced, his boots crunching in the snow, his badge glinting like a lie he wasn't sure he believed anymore. Rufus moaned, half-conscious, his words slurring about bounties and land and men who didn't forgive. By dawn, the snow fell again, soft but relentless, covering the blood, the ash, the tracks. Samuel cut Amos's ropes, his hands shaking, his eyes low. "I'm not my father," he said, almost to himself. Tala stood, her coat patched, her bow slung across her back. She looked at Samuel, not with gratitude, but with something closer to understanding. "You're not," she said, her voice quiet, final. They left Rufus tied to a tree, his wounds bound, his curses fading into the wind. The camp was silent, the Shoshone gone deeper into the hills, leaving only tracks and embers. Amos, Tala, and Samuel rode north, toward the Shoshone lands, where the snow was quieter, the air heavier with stories. The trail was hard, the wind cutting deep, but they rode anyway. Each step a defiance of the men who'd come for Tala, of the past that hunted them all. The village appeared at dusk, a scattering of lodges, half buried in snow, smoke curling from low chimneys. No guards met them, no arrows flew, but eyes watched from behind canvas, sharp and wary. Tala rode ahead, her shoulders straight, her face calm but not soft. Amos and Samuel followed, their horses weary, their breath clouding in the cold. The village was small, its people worn but unbroken, their lodges anchored with stone, their fires steady against the night. Tala dismounted, pulling back her coat to show her empty hands. An elder stepped forward, her face lined with time, her eyes clear despite their cloudiness. She touched Tala's cheek, then her wrist, where the ink still lingered, faded but there. Tala handed her a broken pendant, its edges worn smooth, and the elder nodded, whispering something soft and fierce. The circle opened, and the Shoshone led Tala inside, their voices low, their hands gentle. Amos stayed outside, his boots frozen to the ground, his eyes on the firelight spilling from the lodge. Samuel stood beside him, his badge unpinned now, tucked into his pocket. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above the wind. Amos didn't answer, just watched the lodge, the shadows moving within. A boy no older than 15 came out, handing Amos a blanket, then crouched and placed something in the snow, a metal shape, its edges smoothed. Once a cavalry badge, now melted into a wolf, its head raised, its lines bold and free. Amos picked it up, his fingers trembling, not from cold but from something deeper. The weight was heavier than it should have been, a reminder of what he'd been, what he'd chosen to become. He didn't cry, but his chest ached, a relief he hadn't earned but couldn't refuse. Samuel watched, silent, then turned and walked toward his horse, his steps slow but sure. The night deepened, the sky charcoal, wolves calling from the hills. Amos sat on a stone, the blanket around his shoulders, the wolf badge in his hand. Inside, voices hummed louder, clinking bowls, life going on. He didn't join them, not because he wasn't welcome, but because some doors took time to cross, even when they stood open. Morning broke pale and hard, the snow still falling, the air thick with quiet. Amos stood at the village's edge, his coat buttoned tight, his rifle slung across his back. Tala came to him, her boots crunching in the snow, her coat lined with fur now, her eyes steady. She didn't speak, just stood beside him, her breath clouding in the cold. Amos reached into his pocket and held out the wolf badge, its edges smooth from his touch. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and looked at it a long moment before slipping it into her coat. They didn't need words, not then. The village stirred behind them, fires crackling, children laughing despite the cold. Samuel was gone, his tracks leading back toward the valley. A choice made in silence but carried with weight. Amos and Tala stood together, the wind softer now, the snow easing. But the quiet wasn't peace, not yet. Somewhere out there, Thorn was licking his wounds, and men like him didn't forget. A cry broke the silence, sharp and urgent, from the ravine beyond the village. Amos's hand went to his rifle, Tala's to her bow. Smoke rose again, faint but real, curling over the hills like a promise of things unfinished. Amos met her gaze, saw the fire in her eyes, and nodded. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together, not as savior and saved, but as two souls bound by choices made in the snow. The cry from the ravine cut through the dawn, sharp as a blade, pulling Amos Caldwell and Tala from the fragile quiet of the Shoshone village. Wyoming's Wind River Valley, in the bitter spring of 1885, offered no mercy, snow, smoke, and the promise of men who hunted for bounties, not justice. Amos, a former cavalry scout scarred by a past he couldn't bury, and Tala, a Shoshone woman who'd reclaimed her life from those who branded her as property, had forged a bond in silence and survival. They'd faced fire and bullets, stood against Marshal Elias Thorne and his men, and found an ally in Samuel, the young deputy who chose humanity over his badge. Now, as smoke curled over the hills, they knew the fight wasn't over. In this final part, spanning over 5,000 words, you'll witness their last stand against a world that demands blood for freedom, a truth that reshapes their souls, and a resolution that leaves no question unanswered. Stay with us, because this story asks you to weigh the cost of mercy, the price of defiance, and the courage it takes to rebuild what was broken. The smoke rose thin and gray, twisting above the pines like a signal meant for no one good. Amos gripped his rifle, his knuckles white, his ribs still aching from the fight at the burned camp. Tala stood beside him, her bow drawn, an arrow nocked, her eyes scanning the ravine where the cry had come from. The Shoshone village behind them stirred, women gathering children, men checking bows and knives, their faces set against a fear they'd known too long. The air smelled of wet earth and burning wood, a reminder that spring in Wyoming was just winter with a different face. Amos glanced at Tala, saw the steel in her posture, the way her hands didn't shake. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, rough from disuse. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on the smoke, her jaw tight. They moved toward the ravine, their boots sinking into the thawing mud, Juniper trailing behind, her ears twitching at the wind's low moan. The village elder, the woman who'd welcomed Tala, stood at the lodge's edge, her cloudy eyes sharp, whispering something in Shoshone that Amos didn't catch but felt like a prayer. The ravine was narrow, its walls steep and slick with melting snow. Tracks marked the ground boots, not moccasins, too wide and deep for the Shoshone. Amos crouched, touching the edge of a print, his fingers coming away wet with mud and something darker, blood maybe. Tala pointed to a broken branch, its sap still fresh, and beyond it, a smear of red on a rock. "They're close," she said, her voice steady but sharp like a blade drawn slow. A second cry echoed, softer, more desperate, from deeper in the ravine. Amos's chest tightened, an old soldier's instinct waking. He'd heard cries like that before, on raids he'd tried to forget, when villages burned and mercy was just a word in a book he no longer read. He motioned for Tala to follow, keeping low, the rifle a familiar weight in his hands. The smoke thickened as they descended, curling around them like a living thing, the air bitter with ash and gunpowder. At the ravine's mouth, they found here a Shoshone girl, no older than 12, sprawled in the mud, her leg caught in a trap, its iron jaws rusted but cruel. Blood pooled beneath her breath coming in gasps, her eyes wide with pain and fear. Tala dropped to her knees, her bow forgotten, her hands gentle as she pried at the trap. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "We've got you," the girl whimpered, her small hand clutching Tala's sleeve. Amos scanned the trees, his rifle raised, his heart pounding. The trap wasn't Shoshone too crude, too heavy, the kind bounty hunters used to slow their prey. He saw movement then, a shadow shifting behind a cedar, the glint of a barrel catching the faint dawn light. "Tala," he said, his voice a warning. She didn't look up, her hands still working the trap, but her shoulders tensed ready. The shot came fast, splintering the rock beside Amos's head. He dropped, rolling behind a boulder, his rifle up, firing blind into the trees. The girl screamed, and Tala covered her, shielding her with her body. Another shot, closer, kicking up mud. Amos sighted, saw the Shutera man in a duster, his face half hidden by a scarf, eyes cold as the ice that nearly took Tala months ago. Amos fired, the bullet catching the man's shoulder, sending him staggering into the open. Tala freed the girl, lifting her gently, blood staining her hands. "Go," Amos said, his voice sharp. "Get her to the village." Tala hesitated, her eyes meeting his, a question unasked. "I'm right behind you," he said, softer now, and she nodded, carrying the girl up the ravine. Her steps quick but careful. The shooter wasn't alone. Two more men emerged, one older, his beard gray, his rifle steady, the other younger, his face flushed with adrenaline. Amos recognized the older Onahiram Voss, a bounty hunter who'd ridden with Thorne's crew, a man who'd kill for $1 and call it justice. Voss fired, the bullet grazing Amos's arm, burning hot through his coat. Amos didn't flinch, firing back, hitting the younger man in the leg. The boy fell, cursing, his gun skittering into the mud. Voss didn't stop, reloading with hands to calm for the chaos. Amos moved, keeping low, his boots slipping in the mud. He heard Tala's footsteps fading, the girl's whimpers growing faint, and knew she'd make it to the village. That was enough for now. He ducked behind a fallen log, his breath coming hard, the pain in his arms spreading like fire. Voss called out, his voice mocking. "You're out of your depth, Caldwell. Hand her over, and maybe you walk away." Amos didn't answer, just waited, his eyes on the trees. Voss was circling, his steps deliberate, a hunter who knew his prey was cornered. But Amos wasn't prey, not anymore. He'd been the hunter once, riding with men like Voss, following orders that left blood on his hands and ash in his soul. He wouldn't go back to that. Not for Tala, not for anyone. A twig snapped to his left. Amos spun, firing, the bullet catching Voss in the chest. The man staggered, his rifle falling, his eyes wide with surprise, as if death was something he'd never considered. He dropped, the snow soaking up his blood, his breath gurgling out. The younger man screamed, scrambling for his gun, but Amos was on him, kicking the weapon away, pinning him to the ground. "Who sent you?" Amos growled, his knee on the boy's chest. The boy spat, his face twisted with pain and fear. "Thorn, he ain't done with you." "Or her." Amos pressed harder, the boy gasping. "Where is he?" The boy laughed, a weak, desperate sound. "Close." Too close. Amos tied his hands with a strip of leather, leaving him in the mud, and stood, his eyes scanning the ravine. The smoke was heavier now, coming from the village, not the trees. His heart sank, but he didn't hesitate, running toward the cries, toward Tala. The village was under attack when he arrived, flames licking the lodges, men on horseback circling, firing into the tents. Amos counted 5 Thorn's men, their faces hard, their guns relentless. The Shoshone fought back, arrows flying, knives flashing, but they were outnumbered, their voices drowned by gunfire. Amos saw Tala near the main lodge, her bow drawn, an arrow buried in a rider's shoulder. She moved like she'd been born to this, her hands steady, her eyes fierce. Amos joined her, firing into the chaos, dropping one rider with a clean shot to the chest. The man fell, his horse bolting, and the others turned, their guns swinging toward Amos. He ducked behind a lodge, reloading, his arm burning where the bullet had grazed him. Tala was beside him, her breath sharp, her bow ready. "They're here for me," she said, her voice low, certain. Amos shook his head. "They're here for blood. Don't matter who." A rider charged, his torch raised, aiming for the lodge. Amos fired, missing, the bullet splintering a post. Tala's arrow didn't miss, catching the man in the throat. He fell, the torch hissing out in the snow. The remaining riders regrouped, their leader a man with a scarred face, not Thorn shouting orders. Amos recognized him from years back, a captain turned mercenary, Elias Kane, a man who'd burned villages for profit and called it progress. Kane's eyes locked on Tala, a grin spreading across his face. "There you are," he called, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "Worth more alive, but dead'll do." Amos stepped forward, his rifle raised, but Kane was faster. His revolver flashing, the bullet hitting Amos in the shoulder, knocking him back. Pain exploded, white-hot, but Amos stayed up, firing blindly, forcing Kane to duck. Tala grabbed Amos, pulling him behind the lodge, her hands quick, checking his wound. "Stay down," she said, her voice fierce, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Amos shook his head, blood soaking his coat. "Not leaving you," he said, his voice rough but firm. She nodded, once, and they moved together, keeping low, the flames casting long shadows across the snow. The village fought on, women shielding children, men loosing arrows, but the riders were relentless, their guns cutting through the chaos. Amos saw the elder from before, her hands raised, shouting in Shoshone, her voice steady despite the fire. A rider aimed at her, but Tala's arrow found him first, dropping him from his horse. The elder didn't flinch, just kept shouting, rallying her people. A new sound cut through the fight hooves, fast and heavy, from the ridge. Amos tensed, expecting more of Kane's men, but it was Samuel, his coat torn, his face streaked with mud, his gun raised. He fired, dropping a rider with a single shot, his horse skidding to a stop beside Amos and Tala. "Couldn't stay away," Samuel said, his voice tight, his eyes on Kane. Amos nodded, no time for thanks. Kane laughed, his revolver steady despite the chaos. "You're all dead," he said, his voice cold. "The girl's mine. Her owner's paying good money." Tala's face hardened, her bow drawn, but Amos saw her hands shake. Just for a moment, he stepped in front of her, his rifle up, his shoulder screaming. "She ain't property," he said, his voice low, final. "Never was." Kane fired, the bullet grazing Amos's side, but Amos didn't fall. He fired back, hitting Kane's horse, sending it rearing. Kane leapt clear, rolling into the snow, his revolver still in hand. Samuel fired, missing, but forcing Cain to dive for cover. Tala loosed an arrow, catching Cain's arm, pinning it to a lodgepole. He screamed, his gun falling, blood pooling dark. The remaining riders hesitated, their leader down. The village fighting back with a ferocity that belied their numbers. Samuel shouted, his voice raw, "Go, or your necks." One rider turned, then another, their horses bolting into the trees. The village fell quiet, the flames dying, the snow soaking up the blood. Amos staggered, his vision blurring, but Tala caught him, her hands strong, her eyes fierce. "Stay with me," she said, and he nodded, his breath ragged. Cain was alive, barely, his arm bleeding, his face pale. Samuel stood over him, his gun steady, but his eyes were torn, like he was seeing his father in the man at his feet. "Why her?" Samuel asked, his voice breaking. Cain grinned, blood on his teeth. "Lend. Her marriage ties it to a man with money. You think this is about her? It's about what she's worth." Tala stepped forward, her bow lowered, her voice cold. "I'm worth more than you'll ever know." She didn't fire, didn't need to. The elder approached, her hands steady, and bound Cain's wrists with rawhide. Her movements deliberate, like a ritual. The Shoshone gathered, their faces hard but alive, counting their own, mourning the fallen. A child clung to Tala's leg, her small hands shaking, and Tala knelt, whispering something soft, her hand gentle on the girl's hair. Amos sat against the lodge, his shoulder bandaged with strips of cloth, his breath steadying. Samuel stood nearby, his badge gone, his gun holstered. "What now?" he asked, his voice low, like he was afraid of the answer. Amos looked at Tala, saw the way she stood among her people, not apart, but with them, and knew. "We rebuild," he said, his voice quiet but sure. Spring came slow, the ice cracking along the Wind River, its waters running dark with silt and memory. The village rose from the ashes, lodges rebuilt, fires relit. The Shoshone moving with a quiet strength that spoke of survival, not surrender. Amos stayed, not in the village, but near it, his cabin a mile off, its roof patched, its walls stronger now. He helped haul wood, mend hides, keep watch on the ridge, his shoulders stiff but healing, his scars a map of choices made. Tala was different now, not softer but surer, her hands quick with a needle, her bow never far. She wore the wolf badge sometimes, pinned to her coat, not as a trophy but as a reminder. The ink on her wrist was fading, scrubbed by time and will, the word property barely legible. She didn't hide it, didn't need to. It was hers to carry, hers to erase. Samuel didn't stay. He rode south, his coat patched, his eyes older than his years. He'd left his badge in the snow, a choice that cost him his father's name, but gave him something else, a truth, maybe, or a chance at it. Amos watched him go, no words needed, just a nod that said enough. One morning, Amos stood by the river, the same spot where he'd pulled Tala from the ice months ago. The willows were green now, their branches heavy with new growth. He held a stone, smooth from the current, its edges worn by time. He'd kept it since that day, not knowing why, but knowing it mattered. Tala came to him, her boots silent on the grass, her coat lined with fur, her eyes calm but alive. She took the stone from his hand, her fingers brushing his, and looked at it a long moment. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice steady, not a question but a fact. Amos nodded, his chest tight, not with pain, but with something lighter, something he hadn't felt in years. She tossed the stone into the river, its ripples spreading wide, then took his hand, not out of need but choice. They stood there, the river running steady, the village alive behind them. Children laughed, their voices carrying over the water, mingling with the elders' stories of rivers and resilience. Amos closed his eyes, not to hide, but to feel, to know that some things mercy, trust, freedom were built in the quiet, not the storm. The Shoshone gave Amos a place, not in their lodges but in their trust, a space to exist without judgment. He didn't ask for it, didn't expect it, but he took it, carrying it like the wolf badge in his pocket, heavy but true. Tala walked among her people, her step sure, her voice soft but strong, a woman who'd claimed her name and her life. Cain and his men were gone, their fates decided by the Shoshone, not with violence, but with exile, a punishment harder than death in a land that didn't forgive. Thorn was a shadow now, his name whispered in saloons, but not feared. His power broken by a boy who chose differently. The river carried their story away, not buried but placed, like the stone Tala threw, settled where it belonged. Amos and Tala didn't speak of love, didn't need to. Their bond was forged in what they'd burned and what they'd built, in the silence they shared and the choices they made. The valley stretched before them, green now, alive, its wounds healing under the weight of spring. And in that quiet, Amos knew wasn't a savior, and Tala wasn't saved. They were two souls who'd found each other in the cold, and that was enough. This story isn't just about survival in a frozen valley. It's about what it takes to reclaim a life when the world tries to steal it. It's about the courage to stand against injustice, to choose mercy over vengeance, and to see someone not for what they've done, but for who they are. Amos and Tala rebuilt more than a village. They rebuilt trust, worth, and a sense of belonging that no bounty could take. In the small axe a stone tossed, a badge reshaped, a hand held they found healing. Not perfect but honest. Violence and injustice linger in this world, in the shadows of law and the greed of men like Cain. We invite you to share your thoughts below. How do you weigh the cost of violence against the fight for justice? Have you seen moments where mercy changed a life, or where standing up broke a cycle of pain? Tell us your stand, your story, because these questions matter, and your voice does too. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to keep these tales alive, and walk with us again where the land still remembers.